Hi everyone, this week we've been diving into chapter 3 of Robert's God's Big Picture, where we explore the third major stage of the biblical storyline, the Promised Kingdom. We've also been reading through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, along with Longman's introduction to the Pentateuch. So let's break down what this phase of God's unfolding plan is all about. What aspect of the kingdom is in view? So what exactly is the Promised Kingdom? Roberts explains that after humanity's failure in the garden, the scattering at Babel, God initiates a new phase of his redemptive plan. The key aspect here is God's covenant promise to Abraham. God calls one man, Abraham, and makes him an incredible three-part promise: land, descendants, and blessings. God promises Abraham a specific land, which points back to Eden, promises to make his family into a great nation, addressing the scattering of Babel, and promises that through Abraham all nations of the earth will be blessed, addressing the curse from the fall. This isn't just random history, it's God's deliberate strategy to restore his kingdom on earth. As we see in Genesis 12, God is essentially saying, I'm starting over with one family who will become the vehicle for my blessing to reach the whole world. A quick synopsis of this part of the storyline. The Promised Kingdom unfolds through four major movements in our Bible reading. First, the patriarchs. We see God make this covenant with Abraham, then reaffirm it to Isaac and Jacob. Despite their failures, and there are many, God remains faithful. Joseph's story at the end of Genesis shows God's sovereignty preserving this family through famine into Egypt. Second, the Exodus. This is the ultimate redemption story. God hears his people's cries, raises up Moses, and delivers Israel from slavery through signs and wonders. The Passover and Red Sea crossing become the defining picture of salvation in the Old Testament. Longman emphasizes how this establishes God as Israel's divine warrior and redeemer. Third, the covenant at Sinai. At Mount Sinai, God gives Israel the law, not as a way to earn salvation, but as a guide for how this redeemed people should live as his kingdom of priests. The tabernacle instructions are especially significant because God is coming to dwell among his people again, reversing Eden's exile. Fourth, the wilderness wanderings. Here's where Israel's faith gets tested and repeatedly fails. Yet even in their rebellion, God's presence remains. He's committed to this people despite their unfaithfulness. How does this connect to previous parts of the story? Now, how does this flow from what we studied last week? This is crucial to see. Last week we covered the perfect kingdom, creation where God dwelt with humanity in a perfect relationship, and the rebellious kingdom, the fall where sin shattered that relationship, followed by God's judgment in the flood and at Babel. The promised kingdom is God's direct response to those earlier phases. Let me connect the dots. The fall brought a curse on humanity and the ground. God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:3 explicitly says, all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you, directly countering the curse. 2. Babel, scattered humanity in judgment. God's call of Abraham begins gathering a people through whom he will work. And 3. Eden was the place where God dwelt with humanity. Now in the tabernacle, God is restoring that dwelling. Exodus 25:8 says, let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst. Longman points out something beautiful in his introduction. The Pentateuch isn't just ancient history. It's a foundation of Israel's identity and hope. The God who created, who judged, is now the God who promises and redeems. How does this contribute to seeing the bigger picture? Finally, why does understanding the promised kingdom matter for the holistic big picture of the Bible? Because it establishes the pattern and hope that the rest of the script builds on. Here's what I mean. First, it shows that God initiates salvation. Israel didn't earn or deserve deliverance. God acted because of his covenant faithfulness. This sets up the grace-based storyline that accumulates in Jesus. Second, it reveals that God's plan is both specific and universal. The promises are specific to Abraham's physical descendants, but the purpose is the universal blessing for all nations. Paul picks this up in Galatians 3. Third, it introduces key themes that echo through the rest of the Bible: the Passover lamb, the wilderness testing, the law, the tabernacle presence of God. Every prophet, every psalm, every New Testament writer will draw on these events. Fourth, and most importantly, the promised kingdom remains unfulfilled in this stage. Yes, Israel receives the land, becomes a nation, experiences God's presence, but as Roberts emphasizes, the full blessing, the permanent removal of sin, the nations truly flowing to worship Yahweh, the perfect dwelling of God with humanity, that's still future. It points forward. So as we continue through the biblical storyline, keep these promises in mind. The rest of the Old Testament show Israel living in the land, struggling with the law, longing for the full blessings, and ultimately, as we'll see in future weeks, every one of these promises finds its yes in Jesus Christ, the true seed of Abraham, the final Passover lamb, the one through whom all nations are truly blessed. Next week, we'll see what happens when Israel actually enters the land and the next phase unfolds, the prophetic kingdom. Thank you for watching.